Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 7, and this is Session 1. We're starting a whole new area here, Romans 9 through 11. This is one of those major areas in the book of Romans. And so what I want to start off with in Session 1 is to present you with an overview of this session, of these 3 chapters. Now, why do we need to have this? Because if I give you this overview, you'll kind of see how all of these chapters lay out. It'll give you a context for understanding them. And I think as we work our way through it, instead of everything kind of being a surprise, you already kind of have an idea of how this goes. I've compared these overviews before to climbing in an airplane and just kind of flying over the land and getting to see the topography of the land. You know, here's the hills and here's the mountains and here's the rivers, and then we come back and we get out of the plane and then we kind of start marching our way through it. So I do think this is beneficial for our understanding to be able to do that. And so what I want to get to you right off the bat is to remember what the purpose of the book of Romans is about. Because we know what we've learned here. We've learned about our justification. We've learned about our sanctification. And we learned about us being sons. And we've learned some things about our establishment of sons. But here's what this is doing. The book of Romans is laying the foundation for the... And if we were likening this to a building, which is an edifice, which is we're being edified. But, you know, it's like pouring a slab on the ground to erect a structure up here, and this slab is the book of Romans. And it is laying the foundation for the doctrines of grace in us. And so having said that, let me just take you through these 4 major sections with that in mind. Okay? So Romans 1 through 5 is about our justification by grace. You know about that. Romans chapters 6 through 8 is about our sanctification by grace. Now, Romans 9, 10, and 11 is about the dispensation of grace. This is where Paul is now going to instruct us in some very specific ways about the time in which we are presently living. And although we've been through 12 and 13 already, Romans 12 to 16 is about the application of grace. In other words, learning to live out of God's grace. That's the thing that, I mean, there are plenty of churches that may talk about eternal security, and that would be justification. There may be some that even talk about sanctification. There's fewer yet that talk about the dispensation of grace. But when it comes to learning to live out of God's grace, you remember back when we were first talking about that, you can't live by a bunch of rules, because if you do, no matter how well-intentioned those rules are, you're creating a law, and the law puts your life to death. And the question that was asked in here was, well, if we don't live out of that, what do we live out of? That's an honest question, and that's how little we know about living out of grace. And we should have been, you know, teaching that and learning that all of our lives. And so, anyway, now, we've done the first 2 in our review. We've done the justification, we've done the sanctification. That ended with that end of Romans 8 and our establishment. And just so you know, by the way, Romans 9 through 11 is the 4th part of our establishment as sons. We had 3 over there in chapter 8. This is going to finish up our establishment. So before we begin the education proper in Romans chapter 12, this is the final thing. And so let me just give you some things about it. In those 3 chapters, in Romans 9, 10, and 11, those things all on their own is a whole section of the book of Romans. And they're going to answer 2 very important questions. Number 1, why did God make a dispensational change? And the second major question is, well, what is happening to Israel during this change? Now, it's going to give us more than that But that's the two major questions that this is going to address. Now, I said this is an overview. So even though you have this printed on your notes, I want you to, when we put this on the PowerPoint, I want to kind of walk us through this overview a step at a time so you can see how this lays out. It looks like Paul is going to be responding to objections. And he is. And the reason is because, and you may remember this, but look, when the dispensation of grace started out, let's say, here's his conversion on the Damascus Road. And then, remember, Paul goes to Arabia. The Lord Jesus himself appears to Paul and instructs him. And Paul begins to learn the doctrines concerning the mystery of Christ, or this period of time that God kept secret from the foundation of the world, that no one knew anything about. All of that starts to get revealed to him. And when Paul then gets that initial instruction out of that, and he's gotten himself kind of grounded in it, he's going to start his ministry, his official ministry, and he has two, what's the word I'm looking for? He has two commissions to that ministry. One of them is to the Jew first. And the second one is to the Gentiles. I'm laughing. And I know behind the curtain, Mark is laughing. And I know Sarita's laughing. And my daughter's laughing. So I'm going to let you in on the joke. When I pastored a church up in Carrollton, up in North Texas, it's just right out of the Dallas area, we had some wonderful friends. And there was a couple, a man and his wife. And the man was a wonderful friend. I mean, we'd been in their home, they'd been in our home. I mean, we just loved them to death. But he had gone to Arlington Baptist Seminary to take some classes. And while he was there, of course, you take those classes, you also attend their chapel services. I don't know that it's important. I should have told you what school that was. I kind of feel like I shouldn't have. But anyway, it's not going to be any different anywhere else you go. But anyway, the president of the school would stand up at the chapel service and he would preach a sermon. He was very well known in the particular fellowship of what they were part. Here's the thing you have to understand about the Baptist church. We can't get along with each other, so we split up into all these little factions. And so we have all these different fellowships. So you have oh gosh, it's been so long since I've thought about all that. I don't know if I can remember them. Help me out, Mark. What's those fellowships? You have the IBF. World Baptist Fellowship. The IBFI was the Independent Baptist Fellowship International. The World Baptist Fellowship. There was what? The BBF, right? Which was, help me out. Bible Baptist Fellowship. The WWE. Oh no, I'm sorry. That was wrestling. Sorry. Okay. All right. I had just all those acronyms in my head. Okay. So. You know what? It could have been the WWE if you'd ever been around any of those meetings. All right. So my point is that the guy got up and he preached a sermon called To the Jew First. And because they did not understand what Paul was doing, hopefully you remember this, right? That God is no longer going to be working with Israel in the way that he was. So one of the commissions that was given to Paul was when you go, the first thing you do is you go into the synagogues where the Jews have assembled themselves and you let them know that God is no longer dealing with them the way he did in time past. Now it's different. And they don't have favored nation status anymore. And God is now going to take a message to Gentiles, not through the nation of Israel, but in spite of the nation of Israel. That is something the Jews did not want to hear. That was blasphemy. That's why they wanted to kill Paul. You think about it. This guy shows up out of the blue And he claims to get his instruction from the guy they crucified. And he's telling them that not only was the guy the Son of God, but God has now set them aside in favor of working with Gentiles. I have to tell you, if you're a Jew, you're not going, that's really good. I'm glad they're finally getting a turn. Nobody was doing that. They were thinking, we got to shut this guy down. And they tried. Well, that was what Paul's to the Jew first ministry was. And by the way, that to the Jew first aspect of his ministry, when Paul went to prison in Rome, that was over. That was over. Because now the message had been out there. Now it's just going to be, what are you going to believe? But if you're sitting in a theological seminary or in a Bible college, and you don't know about Paul's unique ministry or his twofold commission, if you don't realize there's been a dispensational change, if you don't know about rightly dividing the word, if you don't understand there's a prophetic program for Israel and a mystery program for the body of Christ, if you don't understand how different they are, then when you read over there where Paul says God called him to go to the Jew first, here's what you think has to happen. Before I can go out here and preach the gospel to Gentiles, I'm going to have to find some Jewish people and witness to them first. So that's what they taught. So this guy got up there and preached a sermon called To the Jew First, and he basically chastised everybody for not witnessing to Jews before they went out and witnessed to the Gentile people they lived around. So our friend heard that sermon and he got convicted. And he said, why didn't you help him out with that, Mike? Well, you know what? I wasn't advocating going out and witnessing to Jews first, but if you'd have read that verse to me and said, what is that? I would have went, I'm not sure. Which is face-saving terminology for I have no clue. So I gave this guy a chance to preach for us one Sunday. You were there, weren't you? Yeah, Mark was there. My kids were there. Everybody at the church was there, and he preached to the Jew first. And if you do it like the college professor did it, you holler those words to the Jew first to make your point to everybody about how dare you go around and just witness those Gentiles on your job. You need to find some Jews and you need to witness to the Jews first because they're God's chosen people. He wants them to hear the gospel first. And that was the whole idea of that. So it was to the Jew first, and then you learn to stomp like the president does when he does it, because he's making this point to the Jew first. And then don't think you're going to do the Jew first, and it was like, and I'm sorry, I had a stroke, I'm a little off on that, but it just, you have all this stuff happening. And so he did that, and so I couldn't help, you know what? I'm trying to maintain my kids who are looking at that going, but no, those two are worse. All right, so when I wrote that on the board and I turned around and I see Sarita going, okay, see, she's conjuring up that memory. Now you're all in on the joke, so there you go. So why did I get off on that? Why did I even do that? I was going somewhere with that. I need to get my train of thought back here. Because what Paul is doing is, as he's going into these synagogues, he is hearing objections to the message that he's bringing to the Jew first. And so he knows, by the way, you know where Paul is when he writes the book of Romans? He's in Corinth. And when he writes that book, he's already been teaching this Romans doctrine. I'm talking about what he wrote in the book of Romans. He's already been teaching that to the Corinthians. That's what got them established. It was when he left, they kind of got off track and abandoned that doctrine. So he has to write 1 Corinthians to get them, back on track. And thankfully they did. Well, he knows that everybody in the body of Christ that understands his doctrine is going to encounter the same objections. And so what he's going to do is he's going to be answering these objections. And so in your notes one time I said Paul's anticipating an objection. He's not really anticipating it. He's already heard that objection and he's answering it so that nobody gets thrown off by the things that they're going to hear. So okay, now folks, here's the overview. We're in the plane, we're flying over, and now what you're going to find is these 3 chapters can be broken down into into 5 major parts, and here they are. The first one is Romans chapter 9, verses 1 through 5, and that's the declaration that God has not finished and completed His plan and purpose with the nation of Israel. He has not. He has not done everything with them that He intended to do. The second major division in those 3 chapters is chapter 9, verses 6 to verse 33. And that is where Paul makes an explanation of what has happened to the nation of Israel. That completes chapter 9. Now chapter 10, verse 1 to 21, is the third of these 5 major parts. And this is the details about Israel's stumbling. He's going to define what that is and tell you about it so that you understand what they did and what was happening because of that. The fourth major division in these chapters is Romans 11, verses 1 to 29. And that is where Paul gives you Israel's present state, and he describes that. And along with that, he is also going to talk about their future state. Now, if you wanted to divide those into 2, I guess you could, but it's talking about the status of Israel, and that's why it's lumped into one here. So it's Israel's present and future state. And then the last major part is Romans 11, verses 30 to 36. That completes chapter 11. And that is talking to us about how we should think about the fact that God has temporarily set Israel aside and turned to us Gentiles. How should we be thinking about that? What should be going on as far as what it means to us that we know that has happened? All right, now, when we're done with this, in these 3 chapters, we should have a real understanding of what God has done with the nation of Israel during this dispensation of grace. We should also understand that what He has done is temporary in nature and not permanent. And lastly, we should understand that we are living in that period of time that God kept secret and hidden from the foundation of the world. Now, I think you already know a good bit about that. We did go through 9 through 11, but I will tell you that there were some things that we didn't cover when we went through the first time. So instead of repeating everything we did the first time, I'm just going to make allusion to the very important things that we should know and then highlight some things we did not cover to enhance our understanding of these chapters. So now that we've done kind of this big flyover and we've seen these 3 chapters are now comprised of these 5 major... Oh, did I even put the last one up there? Okay. The 1, 2, 3, 4. Why not? Oh, I didn't have room. I took the first one off to make room for the last one. But those 5 major parts. Anyway, what I want to do now is I want to show you that some of these major parts are also broken into subparts. This will help us understand each one. So here it is. Romans 9, 1 through 5 is the declaration that God has not fulfilled His plan and purpose with Israel. And that's true. But folks, I'm not going to break that down any further. That is exactly what that is. There's one point to it, and that's the point. Now, here's major point number 2. the explanation of what has happened to Israel. And when we look at that, and by the way, that's in verses 6 to 33, we can break that up into 4 component parts. And let me show you what they are. Number 1 is verses 6 to 13. And here's those objections that I was talking about. Because what someone is going to do is look at the apostate element that rejected Jesus and this little remnant, this little flock. And they're going to look at that and they're going to say, well, that wasn't a very successful endeavor. If most of the people rejected it, it looks like the Word of God didn't do a very good job of accomplishing what God wanted. That's what is being said to Paul when he's in these synagogues. And he's going to explain that the Word of God has not failed, but it's done exactly what it was supposed to do. And so, let me just put this on the board here. In verses 6 through 13, and this is that second major point that we're breaking these 4 things down into. In verses 6 through 13, when they raise this objection, they're saying the Word of God is unreliable because it sure hasn't done a very good job with Israel. Here's the second component part, verses 14 to 18. And they're saying, hey, you know what? God made some promises to Israel, and He hasn't completed those promises. She didn't get everything that was promised. In fact, the Jews are saying, we didn't get everything that was promised. And for God to suddenly, Paul, if you're telling the truth, to set us aside, that's unfair and unrighteous. And what they're saying here is, because God is doing that, God is unreliable. So the first charge is, His Word is unreliable. If what you're saying is true, Paul, that Word hasn't done a very good job. And then he said, well, you know what? God's not dealing with you the way He was before. Now they're going to say, well, that's not fair. God is unrighteous. And that means He's unreliable. Here's the third part. Verses 19 to 29. Now, because of how Paul answers this one, and how Paul answers this one, when you get to verses 19 to 29, they're going to look at these 2 answers, and they're going to say, oh, well, if that's true, Paul, so he's going to answer that the Word is reliable and God is reliable, but they're going to come along and they're going to look at that and they're going to say, well, if that's true, then you know what? God's plan is unreliable. That's not a very good plan. If what is happening, the Word has done what it's supposed to do, and God has done what He's supposed to do, this doesn't look like a very good plan to us. So that's their complaint about that. And so here's the fourth part of this second major point, and that's verses 30 to 33. And in those, Paul's going to make some concluding statements. He's going to sum up his whole argument here based on everything that he has said up to that point. But here's what he's going to say in his conclusion. The problem is not with God, it's with Israel. He's going to say, oh yeah, I'll guarantee you there's a problem. But the problem is not because God's Word is unreliable, or God Himself is unreliable, or His plan is unreliable. The problem is with you Jews. That's where the problem is. And He's going to lay it right at their feet. So now, you see how this major point that I'm giving you here, this is going to be Romans chapter 9, verses 6 to 33, here's the 4 main parts of that, where Paul is now going to be responding. He's going to be telling us in the book of Romans the same things he's been hearing people object to when he's gone into these synagogues to tell Israel what God has decided about everything and how He is now dealing with them. And they're going to object to that, and that is the way that is going to work. Now, major point number 3. Everybody caught up with me here? Because the only thing you don't have on your notes is what I have written on the board right here, and that's why I went to the trouble to write that, those unreliable issues. Major point number 3 is Romans 10, 1 to 21, and that is the details of Israel's stumbling. And that section, those 21 verses, only have 2 parts to them, and here they are. Part number 1 is verses 1 to 13, and that answers the question of why Israel stumbled and why they continue to stumble. And Paul is going to explain that in those 13 verses. Then in the second half of that section, verses 14 to 21, he is going to prove that Israel is responsible for her own stumbling. This is not the fault of God's Word. It's not the fault of God. It's not the fault of God's plan. As he said at the end here, the problem is with Israel. So now he's going to come back and give you the details. Here's why Israel stumbled. It's why they continue to stumble. And that she's responsible for that, not God. She made a decision about that. Now we're going to come to the 4th major point. And the 4th major point is Romans 11, 1 through 29. And as you recall, that is talking, oh good, I got 20 seconds. I got to get through this because I gave myself an extra minute, so I set it a minute short. So here we go. Israel's present and future states. And so just to walk through them, here we are. Verses 1 to 6. God has not cast Israel away forever, and why? This is not a permanent thing that God has done in setting them aside. Number 2, verses 7 to 10. God has blinded Israel. And we need to understand what that means. What does that mean that God has blinded Israel? The 3rd part is verses 11 to 24, and that shows that the fall is not permanent. Their fall. Now that's not the blinding and the fall, 2 different things. The fall is not permanent, and why? Part number 4, verse 25, Israel's blindness is temporary, and when it ends. He has told them exactly how long this blindness is going to go on. And then the last and the 5th part of this is verses 26 to 29, and that is the assurance that the fullness of God's plan and purpose with Israel is yet to come, and it is certain. Now, major point number 5, it says what it means to us that God has set Israel aside and dealt with us Gentiles. That is the point. There is no sub-points to that. That's the point, and that's all there is to it. So here's what I'm going to say to end this first session. I would suggest that you take this outline and you go, if you have that wide margin capacity in your Bible, and kind of section off this week how this outline goes in this part right here, because this is going to help you when you go back over and you start to read these verses to be able to look and say, this is what Paul is doing. He's answering this objection, or he's talking about their stumbling, or he's explaining what it means to us, or whatever it is that you're reading there, to be able to look at that and say, okay, here's what he's doing. So you already have in your mind, you're kind of set up for the information that you're about to receive. And here's the last thing that I'll tell you to end this session. I would suggest that no matter how you want to do it, read and reread and read over and over again Romans 9, 10, and 11 while we're going through this review on this. Because the more familiar you are with the terminology and the verses, the easier all of this is going to fall into place for us. And I would say this about everything that we're studying, but just read it over and over again. And if you want to swap them off, and you know what, sometime tomorrow you're going to read Romans 9, the next day Romans 10, the next day Romans, however you want to do it. Read all 3 chapters every night. Whatever, I'm just encouraging you to the most you can is to go ahead and read those. All right, we're going to cut off here. That's the end of the overview. We'll come back in session 2 and we'll have some really interesting things to talk